Hi, guys, and welcome to another edition of Zupo's SEO Talking Tea. Today's conversation is, do podcast appearances help your SEO? I think this is an important conversation because podcasts are very popular, and I think a lot of people get invited to podcasts and they want to ask, is this going to really help my SEO bottom line? So I want to kind of go over that conversation today. But before we jump on it, I do want to introduce the tea we have today. Today we have a pu'er tea gifted from my maternal grandmother. She gifted this tea to me last year. I really enjoyed it, so she gave me another round of it this year. So I do drink this one pretty heavily. I drink it probably, every other day, or yeah, probably every other day. It's a nice little fermented tea that gives me that like kick, almost the same as a black coffee, but just without the heavy anxiety after. Because I would admit black coffee can give me a little bit of a anxious feeling, and then I definitely am one of those people that feels like crash. But let's go ahead and get on brewing. So, do podcast appearances help your SEO? At the bottom end of this conversation, it comes really down to getting the link. At the end of the day, if you can acquire a link from a podcast, that's good. That will help your SEO. But what I will say is that, I think when people hear podcasts, I think the main thing they think about is exposure, which is its own great opportunity. But again, if we're just strictly talking about SEO, the real value of SEO comes to links and referring domains. So it doesn't matter about the exposure. It really comes down for SEO consideration. What is the value of the link? So therefore, if a podcast doesn't have a website and it doesn't really have a place where it hosts its information, then it may not be worth it. And those do exist. I have seen podcasts where they really don't have a website or anything. They just have their podcast you can download on Google Play Music or Apple Music or wherever it might be. Those aren't that valuable. You have to treat podcasts very similar to other publications when you do guest contributions or something like that. You need to identify if the podcast has a website and how strong that website is. I have seen podcasts that are quite strong, they have a strong following, they have a lot of episodes, but their website's really weak. So even though if one of my clients or myself went on the podcast, though they have a big audience, when it comes to SEO considerations, because the site's so weak, the value of that link would be so low. So again, the exposure on its own marketing front might be really good, but when we're talking about strictly SEO, I would say before if you're evaluating and doing podcast appearances simply for the SEO value, you need to still do your homework. Podcasts don't inherently give you SEO value. It's always going to come down to those links. So go ahead and then check the podcasts. Do they have a website? Does the website have a strong, domain authority or domain rating? And then see if the typical links that they send out, what's the typical UR of those pages? Because oftentimes what can happen is a website can be a subdomain of the provider. So I'm not that well versed in the podcast world, but I know a lot of podcasts will host their website on the provider that hosts their podcast. So it'll be like podcast.domain.com. The domain rating can be a little tricky because the domain rating will give you the score of the domain as a whole, but what you really want to do is for the subdomain. So sometimes I've seen huge domain ratings, but the actual value of that subdomain site is weak. So check the UR and the DR, check the average UR going out of that podcast site and see the actual value, and that will tell you if it's worth the podcast. Now, I'm not saying that podcasts are bad. I actually think you should go to every opportunity that you can get, but if we are evaluating someone's precious time and we have to tier out what is the best ones to go for, podcasts should not be put on the pedestal, nor should they be put down on the bottom. What's most important about them is the ability to acquire the link, that's number one, and two, the value of the site. So it really just breaks down to the same old thing. There is one thing I will say though, when you're doing guest contributions, there usually is more opportunity to put in body links in the text. Like you can drive those links. What I find with podcasts is usually you only get a link to your website, you don't get a link anywhere else. That can be a little bit of an issue, so that can also segment our decision making because we always want to have unbody links pointing to pages other than our homepage. So sometimes podcasts can be a little bit limited, but it depends on the podcast. Some of them publish transcripts and then the links can go in the transcript. But there's more hoops to kind of jump around with those. But I'd say, again, podcasts aren't something that I would avoid. I would just say that there are a little bit more nuances to them, and so just treat them the same as blogs. And I had another video about this. How strong is the site? How strong are the UR of and the links coming out of that website? Do they provide you a follow link, and how many follow links, and can they go beyond the homepage? And that's kind of important to understand when you're evaluating if a podcast is worth it. So hopefully that will help guide you on understanding if someone asks you to join their podcast, if it's worth the SEO value. If you guys found that video valuable, please like and subscribe. I'm gonna go ahead and enjoy my routine now, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Thanks, everybody.